Okay, this is social welfare policy or social policy part two. All right, so we talked about why Americans perhaps don't like social policies because they want smaller government. We said that there's no strong party to the left, although this statement really has changed, right, as Bernie Sanders entered the presidential race, has reinvigorated the progressive Democrat movement, and we've seen senators who are progressives become elected. So this argument might change in the sense that we might start to get a progressive democratic faction that then will encourage the development of the welfare state. But the other argument has been that the labor movement in the United States was weak in comparison to other countries. And I'm going to show you a video in a little bit on Italy's workers' rights and how they consider that important for their health and well-being. And so pay attention to the strengths of their labor movement. In the United States, some scholars have argued that the right to vote in the United States was not tied with a workers' movement. And so because unions did not push the right to vote, they ended up not having the same power that they did in Europe, where the unions got the working class the right to vote in a lot of Europe. And so their labor movement was stronger, and in a sense, they were able to ensure or negotiate with the governments for welfare protections for the working class. There are some competing arguments, right? We talked about the Martin Gill's argument about racism. There is also a scholar that argues that one of the reasons why we don't have a strong social welfare state in the United States is that we never had feudalism, right? And so feudalism was a class system, uh, but there was this idea of communal living. So although the the people who tilled the land did not have property rights, the baron or the lord that was responsible for the land was also responsible for the subject. So it was this idea ingrained in societies that had feudalism that the wealthy were in some sense responsible for the health and the well-being of the people who they make their wealth off of, right? So barons or lords were judged based on how they took care of the people that they were responsible for. And so in the United States, when the country was created, the immigrants to this country were very passionate about not creating a class system like that existed in Europe because of this feudalist this history of feudalism. Um, but in doing so, and being so committed to not having classes, we didn't have a system where there are classes, right? That there is a lower class, middle class, upper class, but we don't acknowledge them, right? So we don't acknowledge them, and we don't identify with our class. And so when we don't identify with our class, we don't have this feeling of community and we're in it together. And most Americans think they're middle class, even if they're not. So, and in the United States, there isn't this idea or feeling of responsibility that the wealthy have to the poor. Um, this history of feudalism also helped increase the power of the working class because, again, they acknowledged that they were working class, they banded together, they formed unions, and they achieved the right to vote. All right. Okay. Um, in the US, like I said, the goal was to build a classless country. And so the right to vote was not tied to class, though it was tied to land ownership initially, right? Well, some argue that sure, we didn't have medieval feudalism, right? We didn't necessarily had a lord or merchants or laborers or peasants, right? But we had corporate feudalism in the United States. That's the argument was that because welfare benefits in the U.S. are tied to your job, that we developed a sense of corporate feudalism. So, for example, in the United States, 33% of welfare benefits in the United States come from the private or corporate system. They come from your job, they come from your employment. Now compare that to Sweden, where only 4% of welfare benefits come from the private sector. Only 4%. It's a very big difference. Because of this corporate feudalism and this large role that corporations have played in providing welfare benefits to their employees, the United States is said to have developed a shadow welfare state. And what the shadow welfare state is a network of private nonprofits and employers that provide welfare benefits to the citizens. So and sometimes these benefits are subsidized by the government, and we'll talk about that later. Many have argued that the problem with creating these welfare states is that employers now have power over employees in ways that they don't in countries where the government provides welfare benefits. When people decide whether or not they're going to leave their job because they're afraid they're going to lose their health insurance or they're going to lose their disability insurance. If health insurance was not tied to your job, then you would be, or we would be more free in choosing who we wanted to work for. And so historically, employers have, and we'll talk about this, have lobbied to provide health insurance for their workers, to be the ones who provide health insurance, because they realize the power that they have in being the health insurance providers and the government not being the health insurance provider. Again, the shadow welfare state is funded and subsidized by the state and federal government because oftentimes there are incentives to businesses. A common conservative strategy to social welfare benefits is to provide loans or tax exemptions to businesses so that they can hire or employ more workers, right? And that this would stimulate the economy. This would, and then these businesses are the ones that are meant to provide the social welfare benefits. And there's a lot of problems with this system, as we'll discuss in more depth. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the formation of U.S. social policy. And I'm doing it for a few purposes. Number one, I want to demonstrate the types of benefits we do have in the United States. I want to again point out how many of them are categorical and time limited, and how they're disjointed. I also want to demonstrate how policy is done in the United States. In the United States, most change or reform is done through what's called policy incrementalism or incremental policy change. And that is where small changes are made which over a span of 30 years may result in an expansion of a social welfare program. But a giant change or a massive reform is very unlikely given, and that's partly because of the way our government is structured. And so we'll start here by looking at U.S. social policies, then we'll talk about how the way the government is structured can prevent or slow down the speed of reform. Okay, so we talked about the early national minimums that were created in the 1930s. We had the New Deal here, and this was under President Roosevelt during the Great Depression. We had large amounts of unemployment, and in 1935 we had the Social Security Act. And I want to make sure I go over that because Medicare, a health insurance policy we're going to discuss, actually is part of the Social Security Act. It was added on later, but so it's important that we talk about the Social Security Act here. The Social Security Act had two parts. One part was social insurance, and the other part is public assistance. And we said social insurance means that everybody who pays in is eligible to get benefits from there. It's not tied to your income. It's not tied to your neediness, quote unquote. Now this differs from public assistance because public assistance requires usually some income. You can't make over a certain amount, right? They're called means-tested programs. All right. So the social insurance component was twofold. It was unemployment insurance, where we all pay. If you look at your paycheck, you will see you're charged unemployment tax. Then you also pay towards your pension or your retirement. Once you reach a certain age, as long as you have paid you have paid enough for a certain amount of time, you will be able to pull a payment once you reach a certain age. It's a pension plan. It's a retirement benefit. If you are unemployed due to, and not because you're fired, but just because of downsizing or a reason that is not your fault, you can also pull unemployment payments. Those are social insurance programs, again, because everyone is eligible to take part. They're not means tested. You don't have to meet certain eligibility requirements that are attached to your income. The public assistance program of Social Security there's an old age component, and there is a disability insurance component. And I just want to point out how Social Security was expanded because it was very much expanded in a way that demonstrates how in the United States we take part in incremental policy expansion. So in 1950, initially the Social Security Act only applied to certain job categories. In 1950, we increased the number of jobs that could qualify you for Social Security. In 1956, the disability insurance was added. Now, this disability insurance, remember, is means tested. So you can get disability insurance under the Social Security Act if you qualify based on your income. And these are payments. These are cash payments. But in 1956, when the disability insurance benefit was added on, there was an age requirement. So you still had to be 50 years or older in order to get the disability insurance. Well, there we go again with some policy incremental expansion. In 1960, the age requirement, the 50-year-old requirement, was removed. So there was no more age requirement. So as you could see, slowly we're getting more and more benefits. But the Act itself initially didn't contain all of these benefits. Then in 1965, Medicare and Medicaid were added on, and we'll talk about these two healthcare finance programs a bit later. But they were not in the Social Security Act in the 1930s, right? So in the United States, we tend to expand social policies in this way. Okay, now let's talk about Europe, because you might be wondering why Europe is on this slide. All right, so in the 1880s and 1920s, like in the United States, they began to look at helping industrial workers. But unlike the United States, they started their pension program here. So in the US, we started our Social Security pension program in 1935. Europe started theirs much earlier. They also started creating social insurance programs here, again, earlier than the United States. So when we were just creating our program in 1935, the European countries began expanding theirs. And they slowly expanded their earlier social insurance programs to encompass the entire population. They created, in many countries, a national minimum that was a national minimum amount of money or living standard that nobody would have to live below. And so what that meant was they had disability insurance, old age plans, and many of these countries during this era enacted universal health programs. So, as you can see, European countries were a little bit ahead, or a lot ahead, of the United States. In comparing the United States to Europe and trying to figure out why Europe may have been ahead of the United States, one thing to note was that European countries were much more affected by World War I and World War II, and that their casualties were higher, they were devastated, and as a result, they needed to do something to help their people, right? And so some argue that it was the brunt of the effects of World War I and World War II that necessitated or made more likely these robust social programs that Europe had, including universal health insurance. By comparison, the U.S. welfare state is argued to be laggard or incomplete. In 1935, you may be surprised to note that Medicare for All, a Medicare for All type program was proposed in 1935, along with the Social Security Act. But it did not make it into the Social Security Act. It was argued, those that had his ear argued that he did not have the political capital and it would be too expensive to do both a pension program and a health insurance program at the same time. Also, the American Medical Association, which is a lobbying group of physicians, lobbied to defeat this early national insurance. Now, there are scholars who do argue that the United States did have social policies. They had policies like we talked about the mother's pensions, they had policies for veterans. And they say that it wasn't the wars. That wasn't the reason why we don't have the same type of social policies. It was because the United States was younger and we actually didn't have bureaucracies. And what does that mean is we didn't have government agencies this early on in our history. We didn't have public health departments. We had very little, and when we talk about the development of government in the US, you'll see that the executive branch did not have many branches. They didn't have all the agencies that they have today. They had very few of them. And the local governments were even less professionalized. They had very, very few of little infrastructure, whereas these European countries had much more infrastructure. They were older, they had more professionalized bureaucracies. And in the US, we didn't really develop a bureaucratic government until the 1900s. We also don't have as professionalized or highly respected and well paid national or state civil servants. So in other countries, to be able to work for the government, it is very high status, very well paid. You have to be extremely educated. Holding a government position is like getting a professor job at Harvard. It is a big deal. And so it is argued that European governments are more professionalized as a result than in the United States, where the requirements to get the positions aren't as high and the pay is not as good. In the United States, we also have fragmented government structure. So we have more devolution. We have local governments that have more power than the central national government. And so the argument is that these local interests can affect the national policies. Whereas in European countries, they have more centralized government than we do in the United States. So it makes it easier to have a more developed welfare state. Now, what is interesting is there is one type of social policy or one part of the welfare state in the United States that is significantly greater than that in other countries, or it was at least for a while. We have fallen behind. And that was our extensive public education system. We developed an extensive public education system that was um, worlds ahead of European countries during the Civil War era. Now, again, our school systems have fallen much behind, and now if you look at rankings, many European countries and other countries um, are ahead of us as far as our public education systems. But the time when they were created, they were pretty revolutionary, and they were far ahead of our European counterparts. We talked about the maternalist era. We talked about policies that helped women workers and mothers and children. We were so progressive actually in 1912. I sometimes think we were more progressive than we are now, because in 1912 there was a federal agency called the Children's Bureau. It was a public health oriented agency that was created in the federal government. And in 1921, it was even expanded to fund state and local healthcare education and to give mothers pensions. But, the Children's Bureau was run by women. The directors of the agency were women, which was extremely progressive, and was even more progressive about having a director in 1912 of a federal agency that was a woman is that one of the most prolific directors was a woman who had a lesbian partner, and was identified as a lesbian, and was very open about her relationship at the time, and yet was still appointed to head a federal agency. And one wonders these days in the current administration, it's hard enough for a woman to be appointed to in any administration to be a head of a federal agency, but then to have a woman that identifies as a lesbian um, openly to be appointed, it was a pretty progressive era. Right. And this was a time when women organized for the right to vote, and they were very active as a politically as a coalition. Women really affected policy in the 1920s. Unfortunately, after women got the right to vote, they began to see less appeal in being politically active. And as a group, women have never been as politically influential as in the 1920s, which is kind of surprising. All right, let's see. The American Medical Association mobilized to quash the maternal health clinics that were started by the Children's Bureau because they did not want these women that were not doctors. Well, at the time, women couldn't be doctors, but they didn't want these women to be out in the community doing things that doctors should be doing. And so they ended up convincing the president to get rid of these clinics. Okay, so then came the Great Depression. We already talked about Social Security programs and most of the New Deal era. I want to talk a little bit about the War on Poverty because that was in the 1960s. We had programs that arose like the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, what we call colloquially food stamps, or SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. And then in 1965, we had, Medicare and Medicaid, right? So what was the Aid to Families with Dependent Children? AFDC and its predecessor. They are what people commonly refer to as welfare. Okay. And so these are welfare payments. These are cash assistance payments. Each of these programs were, except for Medicare, right, were means tested, meaning you had to be within a certain income bracket to qualify, and there may be additional requirements, like only mothers could get them. So we had these expansions in the social welfare state throughout the 60s. Then in the 70s and the 80s, we had a backlash against social policy innovations. And Social Security remained pretty popular, as did its partner, Medicare. But these were both considered earned benefits. Remember, these were social insurance policies where popular opinion was, well, we earned it. We paid in, and we all get to benefit from the program. So Social Security still remains popular, although there were lots of stories, and they continue today, about whether or not Social Security is going to go bankrupt. But welfare payments, in particular, were characterized as undeserved handouts. And so in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was elected president, there was an ideological change where government was not the solution but the problem. And his successors continued to try to dismantle the programs. It really wasn't until President Clinton was elected in the 90s that the biggest blow to the social welfare system to date had occurred, and that was ending the welfare payment program. So in the United States, we actually don't have a welfare payment program. What we have is something called TANF, which is temporary assistance that is funded by a block grant from the federal government. Only mothers are eligible. It's time limited to 5 years. And there are work requirements for it. So when people say that we have this robust welfare program that people can stay on for years and years and years, it actually hasn't been correct since the 90s. To be continued.